I'm in Hvalfjörður, or Whale Fjord, which is a fjord, or a longest fjord in Iceland, just north of Reykjavík. Most of you pass completely by it if you're traveling here because you take the tunnel up the western coast on your way north. That's besides the point. Hvalfjörður Whale Fjord, it's the site and the location of the last true whaling station in Iceland, which is just here behind me. Whaling in Iceland is a big controversial topic, of course. It's been really a prominent discussion in the media here recently because we've had some developments regarding this. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about whaling in Iceland. Historically speaking, of course, whaling here up in the frigid North Atlantic was an extremely important part of survival, or an important part of survival at least. Imagine the amount of resources you get from one big ocean mammal like a whale. So even terms like hvalreki, which is the Icelandic word for a beached whale, has found its way into common language as kind of a pseudonym or a synonym I think, for any kind of an unforeseen fortunate windfall. Traditionally, the whaling season in Iceland is roughly 2 months in the summer, from mid-June into mid-August, I believe. It's been on and off for the past few years. It took a break during COVID. It was really about to start up again now with Hvalur, the only remaining big whaling company, or big only real company in Iceland still doing whaling, was planning to start its hunting of fin whales just a few days ago. What happened a few weeks ago, however, was that our Matvælastofnun, which is, if you compare it to the US, is our FDA. It's an agency which looks after the quality of food, drugs, those kind of things, and the welfare of animals being bred or hunted for food. And this is really what happened, that Matvælastofnun, this particular institute, criticized the whaling methods, was saying that this was putting animals under unnecessary duress, so that there was a prolonged what do you call that? A death struggle for those animals, roughly about an hour or so, I think, where they were fighting for their lives. Which, yeah, fair enough. We can all I think, agree that that's something we would not want to do when we are killing animals for food. We want to make it as humane as possible. So what ensues was a lot of debate in society. Always happens when whaling comes up. This is a very controversial topic, not only globally, but here in Iceland as well. There are people that are for it, there are people that are against it. I think over time we are seeing support for whaling dropping drastically, and I believe, this is just my belief, that most of us, at least let's say 50 and younger, are against this. I don't think we see any point in doing this anymore. There is one company which benefits from this. There's no economic impact on the country, and again, just the practices are archaic. Some of the arguments for it is that this is a part of our tradition and history, but most of us, myself included, would just like to say, well, there's a lot of things we used to do in the past and they're a part of our heritage. Let's just box them in as a part of our history and heritage and remember those things, but change our ways. We don't need to do this anymore. This is unnecessary. We truly don't eat whale anymore in Iceland. It's a gimmick which is fed to tourists mainly. Most of the whale actually hunted for food here is sold off abroad to Japan and other countries. So again, the big commotion was that, of course, following that ruling from Matvælastofnun, our institute of the FDA institute, a lot of commotion started because this company, of course, expected not to be able to start, or potentially not be able to start its whaling season, etc., etc. It seemed like everything was going well, that they'd gotten or made some changes and gotten some concessions, or made some concessions that would allow them to actually go ahead and start whaling. I believe 2 days before they were about to set sail, we already had activists streaming up to Iceland to start protesting this and trying to stop the whaling. I think 2 days prior, our Minister of Food, Hunting and Fisheries put a legal ban on whaling this season. What does that mean? I think this is actually a monumental point in time for Icelandic whaling. With this ban in place, there are going to be discussions. This is probably going to be taken up in Parliament and all these things. But I think it's a very high likelihood that this is the death knell of whaling in Iceland. Which I think, again, most modern citizens in Iceland, specifically the lower aged half of the generation, we stand behind that. We don't think that this is, or let's just speak for myself, I don't think this is something we should continue doing. Not only because of, I mean, it's always difficult to do something because you feel like you're giving in to outside pressure. You know, you can, no, it's just the right thing to do, right? We don't need to do this. We were raised on arguments such as that we had to keep the whale population in check because it was eating up our fisheries and was causing an imbalance and those things. And I do believe that more modern research has completely debunked this. A healthy ecosystem with a healthy number of whales in them, which nature tends to regulate by itself, we don't need to intervene, is actually very good for the ecosystem, for the fisheries, for all these things. And also, of course, the whaling industry has a contentious relationship with the whale watching industry in Iceland, which is here in Reykjavik, up in Húsavík in the northeast, and probably in other locations in the country as well, has become one of those big touristy thingies to do. So the tourism industry, I presume, reaps quite a lot more benefit from whale watching than those whaling companies actually get from whaling. Let alone or set aside the ethical slash image effects that these things do have. Yeah, so this could be, or it could be, that Iceland, after decades of arguments with the International Whaling Commission, being probably the only developed country aside from Japan and, well, the Faroe Islands, which does any kind of whaling. I'm assuming the Faroe Islands are still doing their thing. Iceland might actually be dropping off of that list and stopping this completely. I at least hope so. I think it's due time. Let's just try to treat nature as kindly as possible. We are not doing this because we need to survive. We're doing this because our Captain Ahab, who owns this company, who's a hyperbolic, outspoken character, very colorful, his company makes a lot of money just investing in general fisheries, and he's just trying to make more profit. We shouldn't be doing these things for pure profit, right? It should be for survival if we do it at all. But there is something about whataboutism and hypocrisy that I want to mention as well. I'm fully aware of the logical fallacy of whataboutism, which in a nutshell means that, oh, you're criticizing me for doing something, then I'm just gonna, but what about that guy? He's doing something which is equally as bad or worse, and then thus deflecting the attention from myself. However, I would like to point out, having said that I realize that logical fallacy, that there is a lot of hypocrisy regarding activism which is aimed against whaling. This activism comes from the developed world, purely. We're talking the US, Europe, ourselves here in Iceland, I mean, yeah, this part of the world. This part of the world eats a lot of pork. Let's look at that, or take that as an example. Look at how the pork industry treats pigs. You have sows, female pigs. As soon as they're old enough to breed, they're being put into tiny little boxes. They're unable to move. They're artificially inseminated. They give birth, whatever that's called for pigs. The cycle is completed. That cycle is repeated again and again and again and again for a few years, until a point where they are spent physically and mentally, because recent research shows that these are very intelligent and very emotional creatures. So they're driven to insanity, kept in close confinement for years and years until they are no longer able to produce offspring. Then they're sent to the slaughterhouse. So this is happening en masse in the developed world. If I compare the two, would I like to be, and again, we should stop whaling, but let's be clear, I'm happy if we stop whaling. We should all do what we can. But if I could choose, do you want to be a whale who swims around freely in the ocean as a wild animal for years or decades, and then, yes, spends an hour fighting for your life as you're hunted and killed? Or be a pig, a sow, who lives 3, 4, 5 years in confinement, gradually, slowly, I'll say tortured, driven to insanity, and then slaughtered? I'd opt for the whale, to be honest. And this is the hypocrisy. And this is equally true of me. I'm not pointing at other big nations around us. This is equally true for us Icelandic people. It's much easier for me to point at the whaling industry and say, yeah, let's stop doing that, because it doesn't really affect me personally. I don't eat whale. It's a lot more difficult to make those changes when it stops me or my neighbor from getting the bacon with her eggs in the morning. Anyway, that was a short vlog focusing on current events and whaling in Iceland. If you want more information or you're curious about this thing in general, leave a question in the comments and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Otherwise, Uncle Google is your friend. It started raining, so I'm gonna head back. Thanks for coming on this short trip with me to Hvalfjörður. And everything else aside, there is something dramatic about seeing those rusty old whaling boats behind me. There's grim history. Anyway, thanks for joining. See you later.